On a summer morning in 1946, inside an American prisoner of war camp on the flat Kansas plains, a German man who had not spoken a single word since the summer of 1943 stood before a guard at the front gate. His duffel bag hung from one hand. A wooden cane rested in the other. His jaw was set, his eyes steady, and his silence, which had become as much a part of him as the prosthetic leg strapped beneath his trousers pressed against the air like something solid. The American guard, a sergeant with a weathered face and two missing fingers on his left hand, looked at the German and said two words, "Safe travels." And then the German did something that no one in the camp had ever seen him do. He opened his mouth and he spoke. Two words, in English, rough accented, unpracticed, but clear enough to stop the sergeant mid-breath, clear enough to carry the weight of everything that had passed between them over the previous 19 months. Clear enough to change both men in ways that neither would fully understand until years later. What were those two words, and why did they matter so much when spoken by a man who had decided that language itself was no longer worth using, to answer that you must go back? Back to the train, back to the fog, back to a gray November morning in 1944, when three broken men crossed into the heart of a country they had been taught to hate and discovered a truth that would shatter everything they believed. The train was not what they expected. German prisoners captured on the Western Front and shipped across the Atlantic were accustomed to discomfort. They had traveled in the holds of Liberty ships packed below decks in spaces that smelled of diesel and salt, and the particular sourness of men who had not bathed in weeks. They had been processed at the port of Norfolk, Virginia, standing in lines for hours while American clerks recorded their names and ranks with the mechanical efficiency of men stamping parts on a factory floor. But the train that carried them from Virginia toward the interior of the country was a Pullman coach. Upholstered seats, windows with curtains, a ride so smooth it felt like a different century from the rattling freight wagons that had carried them across France and Belgium before their capture. The 40 men in the car looked at the seats and then at each other, searching for the explanation. Prisoners do not ride in comfort. There had to be a reason, and the reason they were certain could not be good. Among those 40 men, three sat close together near the back of the car. Not by choice, by the accident of processing order. They did not know each other's names. They did not know each other's stories. But they recognized each other in the way that only the wounded can recognize the wounded, through the small details that healthy men do not notice. An empty trouser leg pinned neatly below the knee. A sleeve folded and tucked where an arm should be. A wooden peg where a foot once was, its leather straps worn smooth from months of use. Heinrich Folk was 32 years old. Before the war, he had been a blacksmith in a small village outside Dusseldorf, a man who shaped iron on an anvil and measured his days by the ring of the hammer and the glow of the forge. His hands were still strong, his shoulders still broad, but below his left knee there was nothing. A mine in the hedgerows of Normandy had taken it in June of 1944. The field surgeons saved his life in a tent that smelled of blood and carbolic acid. They could not save the limb. What remained was a stump, wrapped in cloth that had not been properly treated in months, and a crude wooden crutch that he kept propped against his thigh like a sentry he did not trust. Heinrich was a man of few words even before the war. The forge had taught him that heat and pressure spoke louder than language. But since the amputation, his silence had deepened into something structural. He did not speak because he had come to believe that the world no longer required his opinion. The world required only his endurance. Next to him sat Ernst Moeller, 24, a farmer's son from Swabia in the southwest of Germany, where the hills rolled gently and the orchards bloomed white in spring. He had grown up with his hands in the earth, pulling turnips and potatoes, feeding livestock before the sun rose, learning the ancient rhythm of seasons and soil that had governed his family's life for generations. He had the kind of face that belonged to country churches and harvest festivals, not to battlefields. Ernst's right arm ended above the elbow. Shrapnel from an artillery barrage during the retreat through Belgium had shattered the bone and torn the muscle beyond repair. The field doctor had been blunt. The arm goes or you go. Ernst chose to live, though the months that followed had tested that choice repeatedly. He had taught himself to button a shirt with one hand, to tie a boot, to eat without spilling. Each small mastery was also a small humiliation, because each one reminded him how effortless these things had been when he was whole. He sat now with his remaining hand resting on his knee, his jaw clenched, his eyes moving across the interior of the train car with the restless vigilance of a man who had learned that safety was an illusion. Across from them both sat Friedrich Brenner, the oldest of the three at 49. Silver ran through his hair. Deep lines framed his eyes. Before the war, he had been a school teacher in a small town in Silesia near the border with Poland. He taught mathematics and history to children who squirmed in their seats and whispered behind their textbooks. He had been a patient man, precise, the kind of man who believed that understanding was the highest purpose a life could serve. The war took his left leg above the knee. The wound came at Kursk on the Eastern Front in the summer of 1943 during the largest tank battle in human history. He had been sheltering in a farmhouse when a Soviet tank round struck the wall. The building collapsed. A concrete beam pinned his leg. By the time they pulled him out, the limb was crushed beyond hope. The amputation was performed on a hospital train heading west. There was no anesthesia beyond a leather strap between his teeth and a nurse who held his hand and told him to breathe. Friedrich had not spoken a word since that summer. Not on the Eastern Front, not during the months of recovery, not during his transfer west, not on the ship across the Atlantic, not one word in over a year. His silence was not the silence of a man in shock. It was deliberate, considered. It was the silence of a man who had concluded that language had betrayed him. Words had sent him to war. Words had justified the slaughter. Words had told him that suffering was glory and sacrifice was the highest duty of a German citizen. He no longer believed any of it. And since he could not separate the true words from the false ones, he stopped using words altogether. But there was something else the other two men did not yet know about Friedrich, something that would not become clear until much later. Friedrich's hometown in Silesia sat in a region that the advancing Soviet army was already claiming. Rumors had spread among the prisoners that the eastern territories would be given to Poland after the war. If the rumors were true, Friedrich's home, his school, his classroom with its cracked blackboard and wooden desks, all of it would cease to be German. He would have no country to return to. His silence, already deep, carried within it the weight of a man who suspected he was not merely a prisoner of war. He was a man whose entire past was being erased while he sat in a Pullman coach watching the Kansas prairie roll by outside the window. The three men did not speak to each other. But between them in the small space of shared proximity, a recognition existed that needed no language. Each man looked at the others and saw a version of his own loss. And each man, without knowing it, had begun the same internal argument. The argument between what they had been told about America and what they were beginning to see with their own eyes. Because what they saw through the windows of the train was impossible. Fields, vast flat golden fields of harvested grain stretching to every horizon. Farmhouses with intact roofs and smoke curling upward into a sky that held no sound of aircraft. Fences running in neat lines along roads without shell craters. Children playing in a yard behind a white schoolhouse. Heinrich stared. For 3 years, every landscape he had passed through were the scars of war. And now rolling past his window at the pace of a peacetime commuter train was a country that appeared untouched. He looked away. The absence of destruction was harder to process than destruction itself. The train slowed. The brakes engaged with a long, low sound that vibrated through the floor. The prisoners stirred. Men who had been dozing opened their eyes. The air inside the car changed, charged with the shared awareness that whatever came next was about to begin. The train stopped. Silence. The engine hissed. Metal cooled. Then boots on gravel outside. Several pairs walking steadily but without urgency. A voice spoke in English, not shouting, steady, clear. The tone of routine. The door opened. Cold November air rushed in along with the pale light of a Kansas afternoon. American soldiers stood on the platform. 6 of them, uniforms clean, helmets straight, rifles slung across their backs, not raised, not aimed, not even held at the ready. One soldier stepped forward, broad face, calm eyes. He spoke slowly as though aware that most of the men inside would understand the tone before the words. All right, step down one at a time. Take your time. A prisoner near the front translated in a whisper. The phrase passed through the car like a ripple. Take your time. The words felt alien, not because of the language, because of the concept. In the German army, there was never time to take. There was always urgency, always pressure. Patience was not a military value. It was something that belonged to another life. The first prisoners climbed down, cautious, heads low, eyes scanning, looking for dogs for fences for the moment the real treatment would begin. Heinrich waited until the aisle cleared, then positioned his crutch and pushed himself upright. The stump throbbed. It always did after hours of sitting. He moved to the door and stopped at the edge. The drop to the platform was perhaps 3 feet. For a man with 2 legs, trivial. For him, a geometry problem that required concentration, balance, and a willingness to accept the possibility of falling in front of the enemy. A guard stepped forward, not quickly, not aggressively, the way a man approaches a horse he does not want to startle. His hand came up, palm open, offering support. Heinrich flinched. Reflex. When a guard moved toward a prisoner in his experience, what followed was never kind. But this hand stayed where it was. Open, steady, waiting. Heinrich looked at the hand, and then he saw something that changed the shape of the moment entirely. The guard's left hand was missing 2 fingers. The index and the middle gone cleanly above the second knuckle. The stumps were healed, smooth. The scars of an old wound, long closed, long accepted. This was not a man untouched by war. This was a man who had given pieces of himself to the same machine that had taken pieces of Heinrich. And yet here he stood in a clean uniform with a calm face offering his damaged hand to an enemy prisoner as though the damage were irrelevant. Heinrich took the hand. The grip was firm. Missing 2 fingers did not weaken it. The guard steadied him as he lowered himself to the platform. Crutch on gravel, boot on solid ground, and then the hand released. No lingering, no condescension. The interaction lasted 5 seconds, perhaps 6. But in those seconds, something fractured inside Heinrich's understanding of the world. Just a hairline crack in the wall between what he had been told about Americans and what had just happened. Ernst jumped down next, stumbling slightly on the gravel. A nearby guard shifted his weight forward, ready to help, then stopped when Ernst steadied himself. They looked at each other. The guard's eyes dropped to Ernst's empty sleeve for a fraction of a second, then returned to his face. No pity, no performance, just the brief acknowledgement of one man seeing another man's reality. Friedrich descended last. His wooden peg made the drop treacherous. He calculated the angles and lowered himself with painstaking precision. The guard watched but did not reach out. When Friedrich was down, the guard nodded once. Not approval, not sympathy, just a small, wordless signal that means you made it. We move on. The prisoners were gathered and directed to walk. The pace was slow, deliberately slow. The guards matched their stride to the speed of the slowest man. Heinrich noticed this immediately. In the German army, a soldier who could not keep pace was left behind or punished. The idea that an entire group would adjust itself to accommodate the wounded was so far outside his experience that his mind offered only one explanation. They are being kind now, so the cruelty later will feel worse. Ernst thought the same. He walked with his jaw locked, waiting for the blow. It had to come. Friedrich thought nothing he could put into words. which was by now his permanent condition. But as they walked, something else caught Heinrich's attention. A figure at the edge of the group, not a guard. Another prisoner, a German younger, late 20s, no visible wounds, back straight, eyes sharp. He walked not with the hunched caution of the other prisoners, but with the rigid posture of a man who still believed in the uniform he wore, even though the insignia had been removed. Heinrich had seen men like this before. Men whose loyalty to the regime had hardened into something that could not be softened by defeat. Men who watched other men and kept lists in their heads. Men who believed that surrender was treason and that anyone who accepted kindness from the enemy was guilty of betrayal. The man's name, Heinrich would learn later, was Klaus Detman, and his presence in the camp would prove that the most dangerous enemy was not always the one outside the wire. Through a line of bare trees, the camp appeared. Wire fencing, guard towers, expected. But inside the perimeter, the grounds were clean. The barracks were solid wooden buildings with glass windows and doors that hung straight. A sign near the gate was posted in both English and German. The German text read, "You are prisoners of the United States Army. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will receive food, shelter, and medical care." Heinrich read it 3 times. Promises from captors were the most dangerous kind. Ernst did not read the sign. He looked toward a building with open windows and the faint sound of metal instruments. Something stirred in his chest that he did not want to name. Friedrich read the sign once, then turned his gaze to the horizon beyond the wire where the Kansas flatlands stretched in every direction. His hand tightened on his cane until the knuckles went white. They walked through the gate. The wire closed behind them. And for a moment, 3 wounded German soldiers felt the same thing at the same time without knowing it. They felt the ground hold steady beneath their feet, and they did not know what to do with that. The processing hall was bright, soap and wood polish, long tables, American clerks with clipboards. A German interpreter, a young American soldier, spoke with a Bavarian accent so precise that Ernst looked up sharply. The interpreter noticed. His family had come from Munich, he said quietly. They left in 1935. He did not say why. Names, ranks, units, dates of capture. The questions came through the interpreter with the patience of a system designed to function regardless of who moved through it. When a prisoner could not remember his unit number, the clerk waited. Then came the question that changed the air for Heinrich. The clerk looked up and asked, "Any medical conditions we should know about?" In the German army, that question meant one thing: can you still be used? Here the tone suggested something different. The tone suggested the answer would determine not what was demanded of him, but what was offered. "I am missing the lower part of my left leg," Heinrich said. The clerk wrote it down. "Medical evaluation next. Through the door on your left." Heinrich moved through the door and found himself in a room that stopped him in his tracks. A proper medical ward, beds in neat rows, white sheets, pillows, cabinets filled with supplies. 2 American doctors in white coats stood near an examination table. The interpreter spoke. "The doctors will examine your injuries. They will determine your current condition and what treatment you require. Please sit on the table." Heinrich sat. The first doctor examined the stump with his fingers pressing along the scar line with a gentleness that was not tentative, but deliberate. He checked for heat swelling infection. His touch was careful. Careful hands know exactly what they are doing and choose to do it gently. How long since this was last properly cared for? 5 months. Perhaps 6. The doctor's pen moved faster. "We will clean and treat the wound site today. Once the tissue has healed, we will arrange for you to be seen at the Army Hospital 12 miles from here. They have a prosthetics fitting program. We will measure you for a proper leg. Wooden socket lined with leather, hinged knee, foot piece, built to your measurements. A proper leg, built to his measurements." The Americans were going to build him a leg. He opened his mouth. No sound came out. The doctor had already turned to request a basin of warm water. And Heinrich sat on the table, pressing his palms flat on either side of his thighs, as though anchoring himself against the possibility that the room might dissolve. Ernst came through the door next, shoulders drawn up, jaw locked, eyes sweeping. He sat. The second doctor examined his arm with methodical care. Circumference, range of motion, nerve sensitivity. Ernst answered in single words, yes, no, there. But his jaw began to loosen by degrees, not because he trusted the doctor, because the doctor's hands told a different story than the one Ernst had been trained to expect. These were the hands of a man who saw a patient, not an enemy. We can provide you with a functional device for your arm, a harness system with a mechanical grip. It operates through straps connected to your opposite shoulder. It will not replace what you lost, but it will allow you to hold tools, to manage daily tasks. Ernst stared. The idea that the enemy would build him a device so he could grip a fork or hold a hoe sat in his mind like a stone in an empty room. Present, undeniable, without context. Friedrich's examination was the longest. The first doctor handled him personally. His movements slowed, his voice dropped half a register, the kind of respect a man shows when he recognizes that the person in front of him has been carrying something heavier than a wound. Friedrich's amputation above the knee meant complex prosthetic requirements. His spine had curved to compensate. His hip sat unevenly. Every step on the wooden pegs sent strain through his entire frame. The doctor examined each issue with geological patience, then spoke at length through the interpreter. Your body has been compensating for the leg you lost. The wooden peg does not match your residual limb or your hip angle. Every step forces your spine to absorb the difference. We are going to send you to the Army hospital for fitting. They will build you a new prosthetic, a socket carved from wood lined with leather shaped to your exact dimensions, a hinged knee joint, a foot piece. The goal is not to erase what happened. The goal is to stop your body from destroying itself. Friedrich's eyes, which had been fixed on the floor, rose. Slowly, as though lifted by a current he did not control. They settled on the doctor's face. The doctor looked back. He did not flinch from the silence. He did not fill it with words. He stood and allowed the moment to exist. Something passed between them. Not trust, not gratitude. Something more fragile. The first fracture in a wall Friedrich had been building since Kursk. A wall made of silence in the belief that no one cared whether he walked in pain or without it. The fracture was thin, but walls that crack never fully close again. The examinations ended in late afternoon. The three men were led to the mess hall. Long tables, windows fogged from cooking heat, and a smell that stopped all three of them in the doorway. Real food, not watery turnip broth, not bread that crumbled to powder, not ersatz coffee made from roasted barley. This was meat, potatoes, bread with weight, and beneath it all the unmistakable aroma of actual coffee. Bowls of stew, thick, brown, chunks of beef among carrots and potatoes, 2 slices of bread, butter, a tin cup of steaming coffee. 40 men sat down, none ate. They waited for the condition, the command, the revelation that this was a trick. Every man had been trained by years of war to understand that comfort was never free. A guard spoke. The interpreter translated. Go ahead, eat. It is yours. Silence. Heinrich lifted his spoon first, dipped it slowly, brought it to his lips. Warmth, salt. The depth of meat cooked slowly. It was mess hall stew prepared in quantity seasoned simply. But to a body that had subsisted on survival rations for half a year, it was something that traveled from the mouth through the chest and into regions of memory that had nothing to do with the stomach. The stew tasted like his mother's kitchen, like the house outside Dusseldorf where the forge heat crept through the walls in winter. He had locked that memory away because softness gets soldiers killed. But the stew picked the lock before he could stop it. His hand trembled. He set the spoon down and pressed his palm flat on the table. Not weakness. The strength of the memory was more than he had been prepared to hold. Ernst ate quickly at first. One hand practiced motions. But around the fourth spoonful, the speed decreased. His shoulders dropped. He reached for the bread, tore a piece, pressed it into the stew the way his mother had taught him when he was 5 years old in the farmhouse kitchen in Swabia. The memory arrived uninvited. He let it stay. Friedrich sat before his bowl for a long time. He held the spoon but did not raise it. Then he lifted it, dipped, ate, closed his eyes. The breath that followed was structural. Something deep in his body shifted, made room, accepted a feeling that had been standing outside for so long it had nearly given up. He was being cared for by the enemy, and the care was real. When his eyes opened, they were wet. He did not wipe them. He took another bite. The wetness dried on his own because Friedrich Brenner did not cry. He simply allowed his body to register what his mind had not yet agreed to believe. That night, the barracks were warm, a wood stove in the center, clean mattresses, wool blankets. Heinrich lay on his back and stared at the ceiling. Pine, unvarnished, the faint smell of forest. He waited for the trap. The door stayed closed. The stove crackled. The night settled over the camp like a hand cupping a flame. Morning came without sirens, without shouts. Just light through the windows and the slow stirring of men adjusting to the bewildering normalcy of safety. A guard entered with a clipboard, work assignments based on medical evaluations. Heinrich to the workshop, Ernst to the camp garden, Friedrich to the army hospital for prosthetic fitting. But before they could split apart, a voice came from across the barracks, low, in German, not directed at anyone specifically, but spoken loud enough for everyone to hear. They feed us to make us forget who we are. Do not forget. Any man who accepts American kindness is a traitor to Germany. Klaus Detman stood near the door, eyes sharp, back straight. His expression carried not anger, but something worse. Certainty. The absolute, unshakable certainty of a man who believed he was the last honest German in a room full of cowards. Heinrich held the gaze for 2 seconds. Then he took his crutch and walked out. But the words followed him. They settled into his mind like a splinter beneath the skin. The workshop smelled of sawdust and machine oil. 2 American technicians ran the space, civilian tradesmen in army jackets who understood wood and metal better than military hierarchy. One of them looked at Heinrich in the doorway. "You are the blacksmith." Not a question, a statement. The man addressed Heinrich not by rank, not by prisoner number, but by his trade. By the thing he had been before the war reduced him to a body with a serial number. 4 words. And in those 4 words, something in the forge in Dusseldorf, in the minefields of Normandy, and the processing line at Norfolk had all failed to provide. Recognition, not of what he had lost, of what he still was. The technician placed a rasp in his hand. "We will get you fitted for a proper leg soon. Until then, you work seated. Farm equipment repairs. The local farms are short-handed. Think you can manage?" Heinrich looked at the rasp, felt its weight. His thumb found the edge, automatically testing sharpness, the way his hands had tested every tool since his father first placed a hammer in his grip when he was 12. He nodded, sat down at the bench, and began to work. The rasp bit into wood. Shavings curled in pale spirals. Each stroke was precise, and as he worked, the constant hum of vigilance that had been his companion since the front began to diminish. Not because the fears had been answered, but because his hands were doing what they knew how to do. Bench, tool, wood, breath. For the first time since Normandy, Heinrich Vogt existed in the present moment. Outside, Ernst followed a guard and 4 other prisoners to the garden. Half an acre of late-season vegetables near the southern fence. Dark soil, moist, recently turned. clear the spent plants, turn the soil for winter, stack tools when finished. Ernst took a hoe. The long handle was awkward with one hand. He widened his stance, adjusted his grip, and swung the blade into the earth. The soil broke cleanly, nothing like the stubborn clay in Swabia. He found a rhythm that drew from a place the war had failed to reach, a place that remembered seasons. 20 minutes in the guard approached. He did not inspect or critique. He watched for a moment, then spoke. Use your knee to brace the handle when you need more leverage. Like this. He demonstrated, pressing the shaft against his thigh. Same method they use on farms in Oklahoma where men have lost arms to threshers. Works in any soil. Ernst tried it. The hoe bit deeper, the strain in his shoulder halved. He looked at the guard, searching for the mockery. The guard had already moved on, as though teaching a one-armed man a better technique was no different from showing anyone a more efficient way to work. The smallness of it, the ordinariness, that was what broke through. Just a man showing another man how to work the soil with the body he had left, and then walking away, as though helping was simply what one did. Ernst stood in the garden with the hoe in his hand and the November sun on his face, and something released inside his chest. Quietly, like a knot loosening enough to let the fibers breathe. Then a movement caught his eye. Beyond the fence, a child, a boy, perhaps 7 years old, standing in the yard of a farmhouse that bordered the camp's southern edge. The boy was watching Ernst's work, not with fear, not with the guarded suspicion the adults in town had shown, with the simple, uncomplicated curiosity of a child observing someone doing a task. The boy waved. The gesture was small, a hand raised, fingers wiggling, the international language of children who have not yet learned that some people are supposed to be enemies. Ernst froze. He had not been waved at by a child since before the war. In Germany, children no longer waved at soldiers. They hid from them. They pressed against their mothers in doorways when uniforms passed. They had learned as children always learned to read the adults around them, and what the adults radiated was fear. This boy radiated nothing but interest. He stood in the Kansas sun in a knitted sweater, watching a one-armed man dig a garden, and he waved because waving was what you did when you saw someone. Ernst lifted his remaining hand. The motion was awkward, unpracticed. His fingers moved stiffly as though they had forgotten the mechanics of a gesture that had once been automatic. He waved back. The boy grinned, then turned and ran toward the farmhouse, chasing something only he could see. And he was gone. Ernst stared at the spot where the child had stood, the empty grass, the fence between them, the absolute simplicity of what had just happened. A wave, a grin, a boy running home. And the realization arriving slowly that such a moment should not be possible between a German prisoner and an American child during a world war. And yet it had happened, because children do not read briefings. They do not study propaganda. They wave at people who are digging in the dirt because digging in the dirt is interesting. He resumed working, but his jaw had changed. The clench was gone. At the Army hospital, Friedrich sat while Dr. Robert Aldridge and a prosthetic technician worked around him. Components on a steel tray, a socket carved from light wood, leather lining, a hinged knee joint, a foot piece, straps and harness. The technician measured, marked, adjusted, fitted the socket, too tight on one side, removed it, shaved a layer, smoothed, tried again. Better. The pressure distributed more evenly. The full assembly was connected. The technician stepped back. Stand when you are ready. Friedrich gripped the table edge, shifted forward. The prosthetic accepted the load. The socket held. The knee responded. He pushed himself upright. Dr. Aldridge placed a hand behind his back. Not pushing, not holding, present. Friedrich took a step, his good leg first. Then the prosthetic. The knee bent. The foot met the floor, uneven, cautious. But a step, not the lurch of the wooden peg. A step with direction and intent in a mechanical joint that cooperated with his body instead of fighting it. A second step, a third, his spine straightened. Not fully, but enough that the man in the room looked less like someone surviving and more like someone beginning. No one spoke. The moment did not require language. It required only witness. Friedrich stopped. His face had not changed, but his chest expanded with a single deep breath from somewhere foundational, and when he released it, the sound was the sound of a man permitting himself to believe that standing upright was not merely function. It was an act of return. The days became weeks. The weeks developed a rhythm. Morning, breakfast, work, lunch, work, dinner, barracks, sleep. No formations, no forced marches. Simply days and within them things to do matched to the bodies that would do them. Then during a break in the workshop, Heinrich noticed something. Sergeant Calloway came in to retrieve a repaired tool handle. He reached for a high shelf, and as his jacket shifted, Heinrich saw the scars on Calloway's left hand clearly, not just the missing fingers. A web of scar tissue running from knuckles to wrist. Calloway caught him looking. He did not withdraw the hand. Sicily, 43, grenade, 3 words, an entire history compressed into a breath. Then Calloway picked up the handle with his 3-fingered grip, tested its weight, nodded at Heinrich in the way tradesmen acknowledged tradesmen, and walked out. The door closed. The workshop was quiet, and Heinrich sat with the rasp in his hand and a thought that would not leave. If the enemy carries his wounds the way I wish I could carry mine, then what does that make him? He did not answer. He went back to work. But the question remained vibrating beneath every stroke. Meanwhile, something darker was moving through the camp. Klaus Detman had been watching. From the first day, he had positioned himself as the moral authority among the prisoners, not through rank, through conviction. He watched who ate with satisfaction, who smiled at guards, who worked willingly, and he kept a record, not written, mental, precise. On the evening of the 4th week, Heinrich returned to the barracks and found the atmosphere changed. A cluster of men sat around Detman, voices low, postures rigid. Every tool you repair goes to an American farmer. Every row you plant feeds American families. Every day you cooperate, you build the strength of the nation that destroyed ours. Do not be deceived by comfort. Comfort is how they turn soldiers into servants. Remember what you are. The words carried authority because they came from the one place the Americans could not reach. The inside, the ideology. The voice that says your suffering has a purpose and comfort is the thing that takes that purpose away. That night a prisoner was found with a split lip and a bruise on his jaw. He said he had fallen. No one believed him. No one said otherwise. The next day Ernst came into the workshop. His face was harder. He sat down and spoke quietly. Detman told me this morning that my mother would be ashamed of me for working in their garden, for using the technique the guard taught me. He said a real German would have refused. Heinrich set down the rasp. He was not a man of speeches. He was a man of iron and fire and the precise application of force to material. But he understood something about materials that applied to men. You cannot shape metal by arguing with it. You shape it by applying steady heat. And sometimes the most important thing is to hold the piece steady while the fire does its work. He picked up the rasp, held it out to Ernst. You know how to use this? Ernst looked at the tool, then at Heinrich. No, then sit down. I will show you. Ernst sat. Heinrich placed a piece of wood in front of him, positioned the rasp in Ernst's remaining hand, and guided the first stroke. The motion was unfamiliar, but the rasp bit into the wood, and shavings curled away, and the surface began to change. They worked in silence. 2 wounded men in an enemy's workshop shaping wood because shaping wood was something they could do. And in the doing without a word about Detman or loyalty or betrayal, the rigidity in Ernst's jaw began once more to ease. Weeks later, the camp administration posted a notice. Prisoners identified as committed ideological threats would be transferred to a segregation facility, Camp Alva in Oklahoma. The transfers would take place within the week. Klaus Detman's name was on the list. The morning of the transfer, Detman walked through the barracks one last time. He stopped near each man he had spoken to privately. He said nothing. He simply looked at them, a long recording look that said, "I will remember." When he reached Heinrich, he paused. Heinrich was lacing his boot. He looked up. Detman's eyes moved from his face to his stump to his face again. Heinrich held the gaze. He did not speak. The rasp had taught him something about holding steady under pressure. Some materials try to break the tool. The answer is not to push harder. The answer is to let the edge do its work and trust the grain. Detman walked out. The door closed, and the air in the barracks went still. Then loose. Then something it had not been since the men arrived. Quiet. The kind of quiet that belongs to a room where the threat has been removed and the body can finally exhale. That evening, men talked freely. Some laughed. A prisoner produced a harmonica and played a melody Heinrich recognized from a beer hall in Dusseldorf before the war. The notes were thin and slightly out of tune, but they moved through the room like light through a window shuttered too long. The three men sat together at dinner. They did not speak. But something had shifted. The shared space was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of men who had come through something together and were beginning, without naming it, to trust the ground again. What none of them knew was that the ground was about to shift one more time. In a small town 10 miles down the road, preparations were underway for an event that had nothing to do with prisoners and everything to do with the men coming home from war. And what they would see would demolish the last wall inside each of them. December arrived, then January. The Kansas winter pressed down on the camp with a cold that was drawing wide and relentless. February brought ice. March brought the first thaw. And by April 1945, as the garden began to show green and the workshop stayed busy with spring repairs for local farms, the war in Europe was collapsing. Rumors moved through the camp like weather. Germany was surrendering. Cities were falling. The end was near. But for the three men, the end was still abstract. What was concrete was the rhythm they had built. The workshop, the garden, the hospital visits, the meals, the guards who maintained order without cruelty, the camp that held them captive in body while slowly setting something free in their minds. Then came the morning that changed everything. Instead of the usual assignments, the three men were told to prepare for supervised labor outside the camp. Seasonal clearing in a nearby town. The interpreter delivered the instructions with the same measured tone as always. But the word that traveled through the barracks carried a different charge. Outside, Heinrich set down his cup and looked at Ernst. Ernst looked at Friedrich. Friedrich adjusted the strap on his prosthetic with more care than usual. The gate opened. They walked through. A truck carried them along a gravel road lined with trees that were just beginning to bud. The landscape unfolded, fields turning green, pastures where cattle grazed, farmhouses with porches and mailboxes and clotheslines, barns with open doors. Ernst watched it all and understood something that settled into his stomach like a stone. Germany had thrown everything into the war. Every factory, every farm, every man, and the country was collapsing. America had sent millions of soldiers across 2 oceans, supplied allies on 3 continents, and its farms still grew. Its cattle still grazed. Its children still played. The disparity was not luck. It was capacity so vast that the war had barely dented this nation. The truck entered a town, one main street, brick buildings, a post office, a general store, a barbershop, a church with a white steeple. The first sound they heard was children laughing behind a schoolhouse. The shock of such a normal sound left Heinrich momentarily still. They unloaded tools, fallen branches to clear, fencing to repair, winter supplies to stack. The kind of work men did in small towns every spring. the kind once done by young men who were now overseas or in hospitals or in graves. They worked through the morning. Townspeople passed. A woman with a grocery bag paused to watch. Two boys on bicycles slowed to stare. The reactions were not warm, not hostile. The reactions of people who had been told enemy prisoners would be working in their town and had decided to neither welcome nor resist the fact. Then the old man appeared, walking slowly from a house across the street, a cane, flannel shirt, a cap washed so many times its color had surrendered. He pointed with his cane toward his property where a large branch had fallen across the path to his front door. The guard relayed the request. Heinrich and Ernst crossed the street. The old man did not step back. His eyes moved from Heinrich's crutch to Ernst's empty sleeve, not with pity, with recognition. They sawed the branch. Heinrich braced while Ernst pulled the saw with one arm. The technique was imperfect, but they found the rhythm. Friedrich arrived to stack the cut wood. When the last piece was placed, the old man spoke one word, in German, spoken with an accent that said he had learned it long ago, perhaps from parents who came from the old country generations before. Danke. The word landed among them like a bell struck once in an empty church. Gratitude from a citizen of the nation they had been sent to destroy, offered without condition. He turned and went inside. The door closed, and the three men stood on his walkway with sawdust on their clothes and the echo of a word that should have been ordinary but was not. They returned to the park. The work continued into the afternoon. And then as the prisoners gathered near the truck, they noticed something happening in the town square. People arriving, families, older couples, children carrying small American flags, a woman arranging flowers on a bandstand decorated with bunting, hand-painted signs leaning against lampposts, a banner strung between two poles. Welcome home. The guard spoke to the interpreter casually. Town ceremony for the boys coming back from Europe. They do this every time a group comes home. Not a national holiday, just a small town in Kansas welcoming its own. Homemade, unscripted, organized by the same women who ran the church bake sale. Nothing official, everything real. The prisoners were not removed, not hidden. They sat on benches at the edge of the square while the ceremony assembled around them. The music started. A brass band. 15 musicians, mostly older men and teenage boys filling chairs left empty by the draft. A trumpet came in a beat late. A trombone slid sharp. But the imperfection was proof. This was not performance. It was a community making noise because noise was what joy sounded like. The first marchers appeared. Young soldiers in dress uniforms. Formation tight. The crowd applauded. A woman called out a name. One soldier broke formation long enough to grin, then snapped back into step. Then the formation changed. Behind the young men came another group, slower, looser, not from carelessness, but because the men within it could not maintain precision. Some walked with canes, some with crutches. One had a prosthetic leg visible below his trousers, its hinge clicking faintly. Another had an empty sleeve pinned with the same neatness Ernst used. A third was in a wheelchair pushed by a woman whose face held no pity. What it held was pride, the kind that does not perform for anyone. It simply exists. The crowd erupted. The applause doubled. People who had been sitting stood. Children were lifted onto shoulders. An elderly woman pressed both hands to her face, tears running, then dropped them and began to clap with a ferocity that turned her palms red. A girl of perhaps 10 ran forward and placed a handful of wildflowers at the feet of the veteran in the wheelchair. The veteran looked at the flowers, then at the girl, then at the sky, and he smiled, the smile of a man who has been seen. Ernst stopped breathing. He did not realize it until his body forced the intake, a sharp gasp he covered with his hand. He watched the veteran with the empty sleeve walk past carrying a small American flag. Not like a prop, like an identity. No shame, no apology. He walked as though the empty sleeve were not a deficit but a credential. In Germany, Ernst knew what happened to men like this. They were moved to the margins, kept out of photographs. A wounded soldier was a contradiction the propaganda could not afford. Here the wounded were leading the procession. Ernst looked down at his own pinned sleeve. He had folded it to minimize visibility because visibility invited pity, and pity was diminishment. That was the logic of his country. Loss subtracted from a man's value. Always. But this American with the same wound walked as though loss had added something. Something the crowd could see and honor and write about on signs made with crayon. Ernst's hand trembled. The framework of his understanding was shifting, rearranging into something painful because it was more accurate than anything he had carried before. Friedrich watched the veterans in wheelchairs, 3 of them, one missing both legs, one with bandages beneath his collar, one whose eyes carried the 1,000-yard stare Friedrich recognized from his own reflection. These men were broken in the same ways he was broken, but they were not hidden. They rolled through the center of their town while neighbors wept and cheered and held signs in adult handwriting and children's handwriting and the shaking handwriting of someone very old. It was the children's signs that struck him hardest. Crooked letters, oversized words, colors bleeding outside the lines. Children do not write what they do not feel. A young veteran with a prosthetic leg walked past, smooth gait. The joint clicked softly. He walked not as a man being tolerated, but as one who belonged. Friedrich looked at his own prosthetic. Same principle, same materials, built by the same nation. For the hero and for the enemy. Not identical in scale, but identical in principle. The principle that a human being who has lost a limb deserves a replacement regardless of the uniform. That evening in the barracks, Heinrich whispered. They cheered for them. Ernst answered, his voice flat from the effort of containment. All of them, the ones on crutches, the ones in chairs. Friedrich lay across the aisle, eyes open. He said nothing, but his breathing was slow and deep, and in the darkness it carried more meaning than words. The months that followed were different. The air inside the camp changed. Men talked freely, played cards, read American newspapers with dictionaries, wrote letters, received letters back. The letters from Germany were the hardest. Heinrich's came from a neighbor. His mother was alive. The house stood, but the forge was damaged. The neighborhood was rubble. Ernst came from his mother. No livestock, grain requisitioned. She was eating root vegetables dug from the edges of the property. Friedrich's came from his wife. She had believed him dead. A service had been held, and the rumors were confirmed. Silesia was being transferred to Polish administration. Their home, their town, the school, all of it would soon belong to another country. If he returned, he would not be returning home. Friedrich read the letter, folded it along the original creases, placed it on the mattress, stood, walked outside, stood at the wire fence and looked across the Kansas plains at a horizon that stretched flat and vast and indifferent to everything. And tears came, not sobbing, just wetness on the face of a man standing alone at a fence in the middle of a foreign country, holding the knowledge that his past had been erased. On the guard tower above Sergeant Calloway stood his watch. He looked down. He saw the figure at the fence, the particular stillness of a man absorbing a blow too large to process standing up, but refusing to sit down. Calloway said nothing, did not descend, did not call out. He simply remained at his post and allowed the man his grief without observation, without intervention, without the intrusion of comfort that had not been requested. It was perhaps the most generous thing Calloway did during the entire 19 months. To witness suffering and choose not to interfere. To guard a man's privacy in the moment of his breaking. To understand that some pain belongs only to the person carrying it, and that the highest form of respect is to let them carry it until they are ready to set it down. Spring had passed. Summer settled over the camp. The war in Europe was over. But before the prisoners could leave, there was one more thing the Americans required. They were assembled in the common room and shown a film, a documentary, footage from the liberation of the concentration camps, Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The projector hummed, the screen flickered, and the images appeared. Bodies stacked like lumber, living skeletons behind wire, ovens, mass graves, children's shoes piled in rooms the size of barns. The machinery of extermination documented in black and white with the merciless clarity of a camera that does not know how to look away. The room was silent, not the silence of the barracks at night or the mess hall before the first spoonful. This was the silence of men confronting something the mind refuses to accept and the eyes refuse to deny. Heinrich gripped the edges of his seat, knuckles white, face gray. Ernst covered his eyes with his remaining hand, removed it, covered them again, as though the decision to look or not to look was itself a moral question he could not resolve. Friedrich watched without blinking. His jaw was set. His eyes were fixed on the screen with an intensity that bordered on violence. He was forcing himself to absorb it, frame by frame, as though witnessing were a punishment he had assigned himself. Because silence in the presence of this was not resistance, it was complicity. When the film ended, the projector threw white light onto a blank screen. No one moved. Heinrich thought I lost my leg fighting for the country that did this. Ernst thought I lost my arm defending the nation that built those ovens. Friedrich thought the language I refuse to speak is the same language that gave the orders for what I just saw. My silence was not protest. My silence was the same silence that allowed this to happen. That night, Friedrich wept for the third time, not for his leg, not for his lost home, for the knowledge that his suffering and the suffering on that screen were products of the same machine built with the obedience of men just like him, who followed orders and asked no questions. The months passed, summer deepened, and finally the notice came: repatriation. The prisoners would be shipped back to Europe, to a Germany that no longer existed in the form any of them remembered. The last week passed with a quality of time none of them had experienced. Each hour was heavy. Each meal was noticed. The workshop smelled the same, but the smell carried the weight of departure. The garden held the same soil, but the seeds were for someone else. Friedrich's prosthetic received its final adjustment from Dr. Aldrich. Wood and leather and a steel hinge, built by the enemy, carried home by the prisoner. Dr. Aldrich shook Friedrich's hand. Brief, firm, two men, one American, one German, connected by the principle that healing is not politics. Healing is what humans owe each other when the politics have finished breaking them. The morning of departure, pale light, the gate, prisoners lined up with duffel bags and letters and prosthetics. Sergeant James Calloway approached, the older man who had been there from the first day, who had offered his damaged hand on the train platform, who had said Sicily 43 grenade, who had stood on the tower and watched Friedrich grieve and had chosen to let the grief be private. Safe travels, Calloway said. 2 words, no ceremony, just the quiet wish of one human being to another at the point where their paths diverged. Heinrich nodded. His throat was tight. Ernst nodded. His jaw was clenched, but not in the old way, in the way of a man holding something he was not ready to release. Friedrich stood still, cane in one hand, bag in the other. He looked at Calloway, not at his uniform or his rank, at the man, at the face that had watched over them for 19 months with a consistency that never wavered into cruelty or collapsed into sentimentality. At the hand with 2 missing fingers that had reached out on the first day and had in reaching begun a chain of fractures that eventually brought down every wall the 3 of them had built. Friedrich opened his mouth. The air between the 2 men changed. Heinrich stopped breathing. Ernst turned his head. The interpreter paused mid-sentence. Friedrich spoke. Thank you. 2 words. In English, not German. The language he chose to break his silence was not the language of his birth, his education, his country, or his past. It was the language of the men who had captured him and fed him and healed him and built him a leg and let him grieve in private and never once treated him as anything less than a man. He chose English because German was the language that had sent him to war. German was the language of the orders and the propaganda and the lies that had cost him his leg and his home and 3 years of his voice. English was the language that had given things back. Not all of them. The leg was gone. The home was gone. But the voice, the willingness to use it, the belief that words could still carry meaning after everything words had been used to do, that the Americans had returned to him. And so the first words he spoke in 3 years were in their language, because using their language was itself the message. Calloway blinked. Something crossed his face too fast and too complex to catalog. Then he nodded, one nod, the same kind the old man in town had given when the branch was cleared. Acknowledgement, completion. The closing of a circle neither man had known they were drawing until the line connected. Friedrich nodded back, then turned and walked toward the truck. He walked steadily, on the leg the Americans built, with the cane they provided, toward a future that held no home, no classroom, no blackboard. He walked, and the ground held. The Atlantic crossing was gray, cold, long. The ship rocked against swells from the west, as though the ocean were trying to push them back. Europe appeared as a gray line on the horizon, then shapes, cranes, docks. The air smelled of concrete dust and the absence of things that had once been present. Germany was not what they remembered. Cities were rubble in patterns suggesting former streets. Villages were hollowed. People moved through wreckage with the careful steps of those who had learned the ground could open beneath them. The three men parted at a railway junction. 3 tracks, 3 destinations. They did not embrace, did not make promises. They simply stood together for a moment. A blacksmith, a farmer, a teacher, connected by wounds in a train and a camp in Kansas and a brass band playing for broken men who were not hidden but honored. Then they nodded and turned and walked. Heinrich returned to Dusseldorf. The forge was damaged. The roof had collapsed on one side, but the stone foundation held and the chimney stood. He cleared the wreckage, hung his tools on the hooks where they had always hung. He lit the fire on a September morning. The kindling caught slowly. The flames were tentative, as though they too had forgotten how to burn, but they caught. And as the coals glowed and the metal began to change color, Heinrich Vogt picked up his hammer and brought it down on the anvil. The sound rang through the empty street, a single clear note that carried through broken windows and open doors. The neighbors heard it. One by one they came, in doorways, at windows. They watched the blacksmith with one leg stand at his forge and shape iron. The sound of the hammer was the first sound of rebuilding, not machinery or government programs or speeches. The sound of one man hitting metal because metal needed to be shaped, and he was the man who knew how. Ernst returned to Swabia. The farm was overgrown. Weeds choked the rows. The barn was empty. His mother stood in the doorway, and when she saw him, she made a sound that had no equivalent in any language. Not a word. The sound of a woman's body releasing grief it had held since the day her son left and did not come back whole. He held her with his one arm. She was lighter than he remembered. The bones of her shoulders pressed against his chest. He understood that strength was not measured in limbs. It was measured in the willingness to hold on when holding on is all you can do. He began the next morning, the hoe in his one hand, the soil dark and cold. He used the technique the guard in Kansas had taught him, bracing the handle against his knee, and the earth turned. Row by row, slow, unglamorous, endless, and enough, because it was real, because it fed people, because it proved that a man with one arm and a piece of land and the patience to tend it could still participate in the ancient agreement between humans and the earth. Friedrich could not go home. Home was now Poland. The streets where he had walked and the school where he had taught existed under a different flag with a different language on the signs. He was among the millions expelled from the Eastern territories, people who arrived in Western Germany with nothing but what they could carry. He drifted west, into the American occupation zone, into Bavaria. He found a school in a small town where the building was damaged, but the walls stood. He cleared the classroom, swept the floor, set the desks upright, found chalk in a drawer that had survived the war intact when almost nothing else had. His wife found him 3 months later. She had been searching since the Red Cross confirmed he was alive. When she appeared in the doorway of the classroom where he stood at the blackboard, writing a mathematics problem for 12 children sitting in chairs they had carried from home, she stopped. And he stopped. And for a long moment, neither moved because the distance between believing someone dead and seeing them alive requires the mind to catch up with the eyes. It requires the heart which had sealed itself against hope to open again. And opening again is the most terrifying thing a heart can do. She crossed the room. He put down the chalk. The children watched. He held her. She held him. On his leg. On the leg the Americans built. The leg that clicked faintly when he walked and bore his weight when he stood and allowed him to stand in front of a classroom and do the thing he was born to do. When the children came back the next day and the day after, because children always come back to any place that offers them stability, Friedrich Brenner stood before them and taught. Not mathematics at first, something simpler, something he had learned in a camp on the other side of the world from men who had every reason to treat him as less than human, but had chosen to treat him as more. He taught them that dignity is not a reward given to the strong. It is a right that belongs to the living. He taught them that an enemy is only an enemy until you see his face up close. He taught them that a nation's true character is not revealed in the wars it wins, but in the way it treats the people it has defeated. He did not say these things directly. He was a teacher. Teachers know the most important lessons are never stated. They are embedded in stories. In the way a man stands when he speaks, in the way his voice changes when he reaches the part where everything he believed turned out to be wrong. The children listened. They always listened, because children can tell the difference between a man who is reciting and a man who is remembering. Years passed. The rubble cleared. Buildings rose. The world moved on to new wars. But in certain kitchens, at certain tables where the light fell a particular way and the coffee was poured and the bread was broken, 3 men told their families about the time they were prisoners in America. They told them about the train with upholstered seats, the guard who offered his damaged hand, the stew that tasted like home, the doctor who built a leg for an enemy, the guard who taught a one-armed man how to use a hoe, the boy who waved through the fence, the old man who said Danke, the town that cheered for its broken soldiers, the sergeant who said safe travels and meant it, the silence that lasted 3 years and ended with 2 words in a language that was not his own. Some who heard believed, some did not. The world has always been divided between those who accept that enemies can be human and those who refuse because accepting it would require them to rethink everything. But the stories existed. In existence, as Friedrich would tell his students while leaning on his cane in front of a blackboard in a town that was not his home, but had become his home because home is not a place. Home is wherever you are allowed to stand and do your work and be seen as a person. Existence is the first requirement for truth. 3 men, 3 towns, a forge, a field, a classroom. 3 lives rebuilt on a foundation laid not by their own country, but by the country they had been sent to fight. History does not often remember men like these. Their names do not appear on monuments. They were not generals or diplomats. They were a blacksmith and a farmer and a teacher. Ordinary men sent to war who came back broken and were healed by the enemy and carried that healing home like a lamp in a dark hallway. And if you listen carefully in the quiet spaces between the events that history prefers to record, you can still hear the echo of what they brought back. Not a weapon, not a treaty, just a truth. Small, stubborn, indestructible. The truth that humanity survives even when nations insist it be forgotten. The hammer still rings on the anvil in a rebuilt forge outside Dusseldorf. The soil still turns under a single hand on a farm in Swabia. The chalk still moves across a blackboard in a school in Bavaria, where a man who lost his home and his leg and his voice found all three again in the most unlikely place imaginable. And somewhere in the space between memory and hope, three men are still walking, one with a crutch, one with an empty sleeve. One on a leg built by the hands of an enemy who looked at him and saw not a prisoner, not a number, not a defeated ideology, but a man. Simply a man who deserved to stand. They are still walking, and the ground holds steady beneath them.